You ever feel like the world is just fragmented, kind of out of our control? It's a common feeling. Well, in today's Explainer, we're diving into a really powerful answer to that feeling, the archetype of the warrior philosopher. It's an old idea, but it's a model for putting thought and action back together to build a life with a bit more backbone. Let's get into it. So, check this out. Way back over 2,000 years ago, the historian Thucydides just nailed a huge vulnerability in any society. He warned that when you separate your thinkers from your doers, your scholars from your warriors, you create this seriously dangerous imbalance. You end up with cowards making the plans and fools carrying them out. And that, right there, is the core problem we're going to unpack today. And that ancient warning, man, it really makes you wonder, right? Here we are in this age of specialists for everything, of massive institutions. Have we accidentally forgotten how to just be whole, capable human beings? I think a lot of us feel that, like we're just passengers in our own lives, not the ones actually flying the plane. And that feeling, the sources we're looking at today call it a modern crisis of spirit. It's this sense of being spiritually drained, and it comes from a bargain that many of us have made without even realizing it. We've traded away pieces of our freedom for the promise of comfort and security. So what happens when we make that trade? We get this deep sense of disconnection. You know the feeling, like you're just a pawn in some big game and you never even saw the rulebook. The source material has a name for this: a moral inversion. Basically, it's when the virtues that make communities strong get flipped on their head and replaced by a system that's all about convenience and control. This slide really lays it out, doesn't it? On one side, you have what our sources call tribal virtues, the big stuff: courage, loyalty, a real sense of belonging. But on the other side, you get what they label civilized vices, where the search for comfort leads to alienation, and a real sense of belonging gets replaced by dependence. It's a pretty stark way of looking at it, but it definitely makes you think. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? How do we tackle this crisis? Well, the sources propose we look to the past, to an ancient archetype that can be a model for getting ourselves and maybe our communities back on track: the warrior philosopher. Now, when you hear warrior philosopher, don't get hung up on the words. This isn't about being a literal soldier or some dusty academic. The warrior philosopher is an ideal, right? It's a synthesis. It's the thinker who can actually do something, and the doer who actually thinks. It's about merging physical competence and courage with a really solid, deep moral compass. So let's break that down. What does that actually look like? Well, it's someone who balances strength with wisdom, who knows when to act and when to just think. They are self-governing and self-protecting. They aren't waiting around for someone else to save them. And here's the really crucial part. Their actions are guided by two big ideas. First is natural law. Think of it as a universal sense of right and wrong. And the second is their true will. That's their unique, authentic purpose, what they were meant to do. So to really get why this archetype is so important right now, we've got to zoom out and look at a pattern that just keeps showing up in history. The sources we're examining call this the pendulum of power. The idea here is pretty simple, but it's also incredibly powerful. Think of societal power like a giant pendulum. On one side, it swings towards decentralized freedom, local communities, more autonomy. On the other side, it swings towards concentrated, top-down control. Now, neither side is automatically evil, but according to our sources, the real danger kicks in when that pendulum gets stuck at one extreme. You can see this cycle play out over and over again. Things often start out decentralized, like the local Viking assemblies or the Iroquois Confederacy. Then maybe a crisis hits and power gets centralized for a bit, like when the Roman Republic would appoint a temporary dictator. But when that centralization stops being temporary and becomes permanent, that's when you see decay and stagnation set in, like the fall of the Roman Empire. And that collapse eventually makes way for renewal, as power flows back to the grassroots. And this quote, this really brings it home. You've got this 18th century British official who's used to kings and a rigid class system, just completely baffled by the Iroquois. He couldn't wrap his head around their commitment to liberty and equality. It's a great reminder that our modern, centralized way of doing things, it's not the only way, not by a long shot. Okay, so that's the big picture, the history lesson. But here's the thing. The path of the warrior philosopher doesn't start out there with society. It starts in here with yourself. It's an inner battle. And the very first fight is about unlearning our own dependence. Bruce Lee, of all people, put it perfectly. He said, "A teacher is just a guide. They can show you the door, but you have to walk through it." True transformation has to come from within. We're so often taught to look outside for all the answers, but at the end of the day, the final authority has to be you. So this path of unlearning really boils down to 3 key steps. First, you have to empty your cup. Be humble, set aside what you think you know so you can actually learn something new. Second, you practice discernment. Absorb what's useful to you, get rid of what's useless, and then add what is uniquely your own. And if you do that, you get to the final step. You find the teacher within. You realize that you are the final gatekeeper to your own knowledge. Now, once you start looking at the world through this lens, you start asking some pretty tough questions. The source material asks us to take a hard look at our most common civic rituals. And it asks, could some of them, without us even realizing it, be programming us for dependence instead of empowerment? For example, and this is a really challenging idea from one of the sources, so just bear with me, it brings up the act of voting. Now, we're all taught to see it as the ultimate act of empowerment, but the argument presented here is that it can also function as a kind of ritual of surrender. The idea is that by participating, we're subtly handing over our personal power, reinforcing our dependence on a massive system, and maybe even weakening our own drive to govern ourselves and our immediate communities. It's a really provocative perspective, meant to make us think about the psychological effects of our actions. So, after all that, after looking at history, the inner battle, these challenging ideas, where does that leave us? What's the path forward? How do we actually start reclaiming our power and maybe, just maybe, start to embody this warrior philosopher ideal? Well, the path forward is actually pretty clear. It's a 3-part call to action. First, train the warrior. That means physical discipline, practical skills, becoming more self-reliant. Second, cultivate the philosopher. Make time to read, to think, to build your own personal code of ethics. And third, and this is huge, build your tribe. Real strength isn't about being a lone wolf. It's about forging real, local connections built on trust and mutual support. And look, this doesn't have to be some huge, intimidating thing. This journey starts with small, real steps. Start a workout routine and stick to it. Pick up a classic like the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Seriously, just organize a simple barbecue and get to know your neighbors. Join a local group, or just take 5 minutes every night to think about your day and whether you lived up to your own principles. That's where it all begins. Which brings us to this final, beautiful paradox. The inner work, the forging of your own principles. That's a road you have to walk by yourself. No one can do it for you. But the whole point of walking that road is to become a stronger, more reliable person for your community, so that in the truest sense of the word, you are never alone. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. In a world that pushes us to be dependent, what's one small step you can take today to reclaim a piece of your own sovereignty?